Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of this week's series in examining racial and ethnic inequalities. In the last video, we learned the difference between race and ethnicity, especially regarding groups. And when we're making people into groups regarding ethnic groups, we're examining the culture of them, as well as perhaps the country of origin that they're associated with, versus just with racial groups, we're examining the physical characteristics that these people have. We also examined some minority groups and what they are, the different characteristics that qualify them, so to speak, to be in a minority group, like basically marrying within that particular group, experiencing some kind of suffering or physical damage, sharing a culture, that kind of thing, as well as different types of groups' experiences over history and over time. And what we're examining today is probably what you might have first thought of when thinking about race and ethnic injustice, and that's racism. So today's topic for this lecture, anyway, for this series, I guess, this video, is examining kind of more the negative aspects, really examining those injustices. And so regarding racism, this concept often motivates the unequal distribution of resources. So really examining that conflict theory regarding unequal power or some sort of inequality that's going on. And in sociology, for our purposes, basically what racism is the belief that humans are subdivided into specific distinct groups. So this could be physically, and that's usually what people kind of just lean towards too. It also can be regarding a person's culture. So thinking back a couple weeks ago to cultural relativism and everything like that, ethnocentrism, this will come back into play. And then as well as just where a person is from too, so that ethnic origin. And regarding this definition too, it's important to note that these people, when regarding this concept, that these groups are so different in how they behave, how they think, and what their actions are, that they can be ranked, and it's usually in a superior or inferior way. Usually they're looked down upon, right? Because that makes a person a racist, is that they think they're kind of superior and whoever they're comparing to is inferior. But regarding racism, it can be expressed at the individual or personal level through just your individual attitudes and behaviors, which is probably what you think of when you hear of racism. But it can also be at the cultural level regarding language, as well as just collective ideologies overall. Then we can zoom back even further and examine racism at a macrostructural level too. Just basically where we do that is thinking about the different social institutions of and how they kind of work and promote this sort of racism that's occurring. Regarding personal racism, that's again what we think about the expression of racist attitudes or behaviors by individual people. And this rests on, like I was saying before, the stereotypes and prejudice kind of come back into play. Well, you guys don't know what prejudice is, but the stereotypes, this kind of racism kind of just rests on top of it. So you kind of have stereotypes, prejudice, and racism. And with personal racism, this type of racism can occur in many forms. Usually, if you think about individuals who use derogatory names, so thinking about the excerpt that I read in our first video regarding Asian Americans, any of those kind of derogatory names, that would be personal racism. Anything where there is hostility towards a certain ethnic group, or even just if you have a high school counselor who kind of steers different people of different races away towards certain subjects just because of their own just personal bias, so to speak, because that's what racism is as well. So they're steering away from hard subjects and thus away from earning a higher wage. They can also be considered racist. So racism can be super obvious, and also it could be super subtle as well. So in examining these two pillars of prejudice and stereotypes, prejudice is also kind of rooted in stereotypes. And if you recall from a couple weeks ago, stereotypes are just those unreliable generalizations about how all of that is applied to everybody in the member in a group, but they don't really recognize the different individual aspects of it. Like Asians are good at math and stuff like that. So regarding prejudice, it is a some other ones regarding race are like Jews are super greedy, you know, they're the money makers, that kind of thing, or like African Americans are on welfare, that kind of aspect of it. Can't think of some other ones. Like Latinos are really good lovers, that kind of aspect. But regarding prejudice, that's basically a negative attitude or belief. So it's in your head towards this entire category of people. Usually it's an ethnic or racial minority, but you can also have prejudice regarding gender and that kind of thing as well, which we'll examine next week. So usually you're thinking about this category of people, but you do not act upon it. That's very, very important, that there isn't any action involved. You're just thinking about it. This can be tied to ethnocentrism and thinking about how your culture is better, you're superior, or your culture is just the norm of everything, even if you're not in an area where the culture that you were socialized into is prominent there. So prejudice is an attitude or belief. So you might think that Asians are good at math, or Latinos are really good lovers, or something like that, but you don't necessarily act towards that. The action is when discrimination occurs. So prejudice is a belief, thinking about it. Discrimination is actually acting on that belief. And this can happen in all sorts of ways. So, and for example, in this picture, discrimination is occurring because of the different types of water quality that African Americans had to drink during segregation. So basically, there's a denial of access to different opportunities, resources, and you're treating somebody differently had they not have these certain characteristics. So if you learn something, for instance, about your roommate, and then all of a sudden you change your behavior because of what different traits or characteristics that roommate has, now that you know about it, that would be called discrimination. And one example of discrimination as well is in the job market. We'll kind of talk about this a little bit later on in the next video when we examine our theories. But there was a famous study done back in 2004, and some economists, there we go, I struggled with that word this week, were sent some fictitious resumes in response to help wanted ads in both Chicago and Boston newspapers. And for some resumes, they put a very African American sounding name, like Jamal or Lakeisha. But for others, they put more of a white sounding name, like Emily or George. And they found that resumes with white names received 50% more callbacks than those with African American names. So based on your name, all the other information was the same. The only difference was the name. So, but those with whiter sounding names were received more callbacks. Most of the time, though, discrimination is very much more subtle. So expressed as like a suspicion or avoidance or something similar like that. And you might not even realize that a person or you is engaging in discrimination. There's a couple studies done back in 1974 where they created an experimental situation where white subjects were led to believe that they were interviewing applicants for a team position for a group making project of some sort. And the applicants were actually Confederates of the researchers, so they were in on it. So basically, the white subjects were the people that they were analyzing, but these applicants were both black and white. And the results show that the interviewers, so the white people, treated the interviewees differently because they were black. So, for instance, the chair distance between the white interviewers and the black interviewees was at a greater distance than white on white. There was less body language, so like leaning forward as if you're interested, that didn't occur much between the white interviewers with the black ones, with the black interviewees, and then there was less eye contact as well, so less of a nonverbal communication approach there. And then the interview actually ended a lot sooner, and they tended to trip over their words a little bit more. So a little bit less confident, a little bit less comfortable as well. And they also did another experiment, the same group of people, to figure out how what the effect was on the applicants. So they kind of switched. So the interviewers were in on it, and then the interviewees were there. And so the interviewers were trained to kind of mimic the behavior of the interviewers in the first experiment, so less eye contact, less leaning forward, moving your chairs farther away for black respondents. And they were trying to see if the applicants performed a little bit less adequately because of these different characteristics that were going on, because of this less friendly behavior. And they actually performed less adequately, so that was supported, and they showed less composure during the interview than others. So that kind of just demonstrates how subtle differences in the way you're treating people actually has a kind of a big effect, right? Your comfort level or your adequate ability to kind of sell yourself when you're in a job interview, that kind of thing. And we are just so unaware of our nonverbal cues as well, right? We don't really have much conscience to them for the most part. So, and we don't really interpret other people's reactions to our nonverbal cues just because we have so much stimuli and so much things that our brain is noticing. We're not really focused on that. So usually when, people are tripping up or something like that, we kind of blame it on them, and it might actually be us, maybe being discriminative or something else. And then prejudice and discrimination can also occur within a particular ethno-racial group as well. This is known as colorism, which is just basically when people of the same characteristic also put down people that have that same characteristic. So back in the early to mid 20th century, a lot of African American churches and social clubs and things like that used skin color to determine the membership or the access to get into these different organizations. So there was this thing called the brown bag test, where membership was only restricted to those who had a lighter complexion when you held up a paper bag to these people. And more recent studies have found that lighter skinned blacks have had higher educational attainment, more prestigious occupations, and higher annual incomes than dark-skinned blacks, regardless of sex, religion, region of residence, age, marital status, or parent social and economic status. So all of those things that kind of usually limit upward mobility, they kind of controlled for, and they were really examining the darkness or lightness of your skin and found that there was a difference there. And there's also this concept called institutional discrimination. And in examining this, it's just basically if we zoom out a lot, it's the denial of equal rights to individual groups resulting from normal operations in a society. So this can be found, and some examples are in the Civil Rights Commission, requiring English. So if an employer only forces their employees to only speak English, even though language instruction really isn't needed, that's a form of institutional discrimination. So people should be able to speak freely in their native tongue if they wish. The whole college admissions scandal that has kind of blown up within the past couple of years, that's a big one regarding institutional discrimination. So admitting children of wealthy people or influential alumni just because of the relationships that people have or the amount of money that you have, so be able to buy in to getting into a prestigious college, that's a sign of discrimination. And that's because you're limiting the poorer people to gain access to education, right? That there shouldn't be any bias there that's going on. Then employment leave policies could also be a form of institutional discrimination as well. Some remedies for institutional discrimination include an affirmative action, which is basically recruiting minorities as well as women into different sectors of jobs, like STEM, for instance, or just basically any type of job regarding minorities. However, this has been pretty controversial, and that's because a lot of people think that by letting one group of minorities, say, come in, you are having discrimination against another one. So you're just basically moving discrimination to another sector. Affirmative action was never really fully implemented, but some aspects of it are still in use today. And then just as a quick recap of this video before the next one, which is examining theory, racism is an ideology that reinforces prejudice, ethnocentrism, and stereotypes. It can be individual, institutional, or even macro. And so it's basically the belief that one race is supreme to another and all the other ones are inferior. And one thing that I didn't mention is that those that are not in the minority usually don't realize how society and its structure limits the different opportunities in, say, education, employment, housing, medical care, or anything like that. One example is a study done by Fegan and O'Brien back in 2003, and they wanted to examine wealthy men and their attitudes on race, because wealthy white men, because that's kind of thinking back to the elite culture kind of aspect where things are occurring behind closed doors. The rich people, we don't have a lot of information about them, so this kind of fills that gap. And one of the questions that they asked these white guys is, do you recall your first meeting with somebody of a minority status? And usually they responded that the people that they first encountered with were either female maids or male servants. So some responses here, some quotes are, although I don't remember my first experience in meeting a black person, I would assume it was, and then ellipses, my grandfather's chauffeur when I was 5 years old. So to me, blacks at that point were people that waited on you. My very first contact with a black person was with a black maid who essentially raised my sister and me. Honestly, the first black person I ever met was probably a household employee at my parents' house a long time ago. So a lot of these are very fond memories, and many of these guys spoke lovingly of household servants because they played an important role in socialization. So kind of thinking back way back when regarding how rich parents didn't really raise their children, they had nannies and governesses and all that, and it still kind of plays into that effect. However, they were also taught that there's a social distancing that has to occur between the help and their own actual family. So, and in this research, it's very clear that these men didn't see that these servants were actual people either. So it kind of really starts on that socialization of everything. And thinking about how they, and then the study also examines like, well, what do you think this is prejudice? What's going on with that? And this is kind of how one person quoted their experience, and it's an example of quiet racism, which is a form of racism where you have negative feelings towards certain groups, but there isn't necessarily hate or hostility, but usually like discomfort or uneasiness. And so the quote is, there are many, many fine Black families around. Unfortunately, a large part of the Black population has this family problem. So there's the it's very, very difficult to generalize why some Blacks work out fine while others don't, and the fact that some could work out exactly the same as anyone else leads me to believe that's not because of the color, it's because of the environment they're brought up in. So this guy is individually distancing himself from the prejudice of the past, but also embracing the reality of racial inequality. So he's recognizing that there's something going on there with that. And even though many of the men that these researchers interviewed were prejudiced, some of them weren't. Minority held very positive attitudes about race relations, and they usually reported feeling dismayed about racial inequalities that were occurring. So, and those who had long-term friendships or extended contact with members of other races showed a willingness to consider dismantling the structures that perpetuate prejudice and racial inequality. So, and that's something that we're going to be examining in the next video, is how our interactions with one another can actually diminish or have us become more aware of the inequalities that are around us. So that's a nice tie-in. To see you next time.